Good afternoon. Well, I hope you've all deciphered the structure of this two-day event. You've had your inspiring overviews and the products that we're incredibly proud of, the students who are benefiting by early versions of what we hope to make more common. And now we are having 3 consecutive sessions, or nearly consecutive sessions, to showcase or to give you an idea of where we're heading with the 3 grand challenges that are starting off this university-wide initiative: energy, then development, then infectious disease. So this is the panel on the Energy Grand Challenge. One of the questions we immediately face is what are the boundaries of an Energy Grand Challenge? And 2 lobes are particularly visible: the lobe called energy security and the lobe called energy and climate. Now, the 4 speakers and I caucused in the previous half hour downstairs, and we agreed that the single thing we most want to carry forward from this panel is that you don't break energy and security into one place and energy and climate into another. It is a single ball of wax. And that is what makes it so interesting and so appropriate for some new structure, some structure that indeed is drawn to the intractable, Steve Pacala's word this morning. We have found, so the theme that drives much of what I've been interested in most all of my career has been fitting on the Earth. We are an exuberant species, and we have got a very big challenge because the planet isn't anywhere near as large as we might wish it is, we might wish it were. We have found already most of the low-cost oil we will ever find. And we have added to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere a significant fraction of what we will ever add. Those are statements of where we are, and we're just becoming aware of both issues at the same time. I think our first speaker will tell us that the hydrocarbons are abundant, but low-cost oil is not. And therefore, there are alternatives we can pursue to go through this transition. And we have to go through them in no small part because the environmental consequences of going to the what is called unconventional oil reserves, sort of next in line, are all bad. They are nastier. They have more CO2 implicated in their development. And so we can turn to energy efficiency, which takes both a technological and a social dimension. This is the home of the urban planning program. Energy efficiency is about the way we lay out cities and have commuting as well as it is about Priuses and batteries. And we may or may not get in the presentation to discussions of biofuels. It's an absolutely fascinating topic that will draw us in. I don't want to say more now because I want to leave as much time for the panel as possible. We've agreed on an order, and the first speaker, Richard Vierbuchen, is a PhD geologist from this institution who has been working for Exxon for much of his career, and he is in charge of the upstream, meaning getting the oil out of the ground, for Exxon with reference especially to the Middle East and the Caspian. Nothing like a person like that to help us ground truth this discussion.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for the invitation to speak here today. I know this is a topic that is on the minds of many people at this time, and Rob, it was great timing on your part to schedule this colloquium for a week in which oil set a new record of $112 a barrel. I don't know if that's a coincidence or if there's a cause and effect there. I wanted to cover 2 topics today for you. The first is to go quickly through some of the high points of our company's annual energy outlook, which will take us out to 2030. And the second is to talk about the global hydrocarbon resource base and just a few points about that and the degree to which it may impact the outlook for supplies over the future. Just to give you a little bit of background on our outlook, this is something we do every year. We have a team of people dedicated to this. We've been doing it for many decades. It's a key input into our strategic planning. It's had a lot of impact on our business over my career. So it's something that we do objectively and as well as we can for our own use and as a source of competitive advantage. And so we're not trying to grind an axe with this. The key conclusions that come out of this outlook are that economic growth will drive energy growth, about 40% higher, more energy used by 2030 than in 2005, and that they're going to be that about 80% of this growth will be in the developing world, and that there are going to be a lot of challenges to meeting this outlook. The first is improving efficiency. Second is developing a wide range of new supplies. And the third is managing environmental risks. We think that technology is going to have a key role in meeting all of these challenges. So let's just start with our outlook and beginning with economics. And of course, the amount and types of energy that we use are closely tied to economic progress. And we expect that in our outlook that real economic growth is going to average about 3% a year over the outlook period, about what it did in the previous 25 or so years. To convert this to energy use, we look at an energy intensity function, which is just a measure of barrels of oil equivalent per unit of GDP. And between 1980 and 2005, energy intensity efficiency increased about 1% per year. And as we look forward, we see a significant increase in the improvements in efficiency to about 1.6% a year. So in 1980, it took about 2.5 barrels of oil to generate $1,000 of GDP. By 2030, it'll be about half that amount. Now, converting this to total energy consumption, through the outlook period, we see total energy demand growing about 1.3% a year. It's a lot slower than it has grown in the recent past. But it still raises total energy consumption, as I said, about 40% to about 335 million barrels per day of oil equivalent. So this is taking all energy types and converting them into oil equivalents. Now, I said that about 80% of this growth is going to be in the developing world. And, you know, it's really hard to appreciate the compounding effect of large populations and increases in energy consumed per capita. But this slide is a way of bringing the point home, I think. You can see that today the OECD countries, which represent about 20% of the world's population, use about 60% of the total electricity that's used in the world in this plot of population versus 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita. North America, for example, is using about 10 times the per capita electricity to most of the people of the world. Now, even though 80% of the energy growth through 2030 is going to be in the developing world, this, if we play this out to 2030, there's still a huge inequality in energy use. And this is one of the factors that is going to continue to drive consumption, this societal need to diminish and we hope eventually eliminate this kind of inequality in energy usage. Now, I chose to show electricity in that slide because power generation is really the largest source of energy demand now and going forward through the outlook. I could equally have used transportation, which is the fastest growing source of energy demand. And we could have said something like, well, today in the U.S. there's a little more than one car for every 2 people, and in China it's like 1 per 40. So there's equivalent inequalities there that there's going to be a lot of pressure to eliminate. Now, if we convert energy use to energy supply, again up at the top you can see that 1.3% average annual growth. That means oil and coal are going to be losing market share over the outlook period, while the other types, gas, nuclear, and renewables, gain market share because they're growing at above average rates. Because gas grows rapidly, the percentage of the total energy budget, in our view, that is supplied by oil and gas will be about the same in 2030. It'll just be more gassier, about the same as it is today, about 60%. One of the things that might surprise you when you look at this outlook is, hey, why are renewables growing so slowly? And I'd like to address that. That's because renewables lump together a lot of things, some of which are going to grow very slowly and some of which are going to grow very fast. Biomass is going to grow at about 0.7% per year. That's mainly wood and dung used by all those people that don't have much access to electricity. Hydro and geothermal will grow at about 2% per year, limited mainly by just the opportunities to use those sources of energy. Wind, solar, and biofuels are the fastest growing sources of energy. Broken out, note the scale change on the far right. These are very, very high rates to sustain over a roughly 25-year period, and they'll make a significant contribution to growing energy needs. But even so, because they begin from such a small base, these rapid growth rates take them to a little less than 2% of total energy supply from these renewables by 2030. Now, the last thing from the outlook that I pulled out of our outlook is this, what does this mean for CO2? And we've tried to take a look at a few sensitivities. Now, if you just play out the outlook without any adjustments other than the accelerating efficiency improvements, we would expect CO2 emissions to grow by 1.2% per year on average to 2030 to 37 billion tons. Obviously, people are going to try to do something about this. And we've shown here 4 steps just as sensitivities. For example, if you doubled biofuels growth through cellulosic ethanol, that's a thin line at the top. That's a decrease of about 0.5%. If you double the expected improvement in fuel economy in light-duty vehicles, that's the first segment you can see there. That's about a 1% reduction. If you replace half the growth in coal with low-carbon alternatives, either carbon capture and sequestration or nuclear, that's a 3% reduction. And if that was done with nuclear, it would require 125 new nuclear plants in addition to the 170 that are already in our outlook. If you replace coal plants at 40 years with low-carbon alternatives, that gives you about a 10% reduction and rolls over CO2 in total, but that would require 500 new nuclear plants through the outlook in addition to the 170 that we're forecasting. So that just gives you a feel for how challenging this is. Now, obviously, there are going to be many, many other approaches, a number of which we're working on and have announced over the last year, and maybe we could talk about that in the discussion period. Now, I want to turn to something I'm a little more intimately familiar with, and that's the world's oil consumption. Demand today is about 86 million barrels a day. It's growing to about 116 million barrels per day in our outlook by 2030. Today, the most prominent source of oil is non-OPEC crude and condensate, and in fact, over the last decade or so, most of each year's annual increase in oil consumption has been supplied by non-OPEC. When we look ahead, we see that non-OPEC's growing in some areas, mainly Russia, Caspian, Brazil. It's going to be declining in a lot of other areas, and the net effect, very slow growth, reaching a peak or plateau around 2020 and probably into gradual decline as you get to the outer part of this outlook period, which has a very important effect of increasing the world's reliance on OPEC for liquid fuels. Looking at some of the other components of the liquid fuel budget, non-OPEC oil sands, heavy oil sands, such as those in Canada and Brazil, but many other parts of the world, are going to grow to about 4 million barrels a day from 1 million barrels a day today. OPEC condensate is going to grow significantly, probably 1 million barrels a day or more. GTLs and coal to liquids will add in total, mainly from GTL, about 1 million barrels a day. Biofuels, as we saw earlier, grows to about 3 million barrels per day. And the call on OPEC rises from just over 30 million barrels a day today to, in this outlook, about 47. So that is a major increase, and it raises the question, does OPEC have the resource to do that? Because if not, there's going to be a real challenge for the world, much more severe than what we're facing today. And probably a lot of you have read some of the books and articles that have been written suggesting that OPEC, particularly the Middle Eastern countries, can achieve that outlook. For example, Twilight in the Desert, book written by Matt Simmons a few years ago, suggested that the kingdom was about to go into oil decline. And their response to that book was to add about 2.5 million barrels a day of capacity. At that time the book came out, they had about 10 million barrels a day of capacity. By next year, they'll be up to 12.5 million barrels a day. And this is all coming from the development of undeveloped discoveries that they're sitting on. They're sitting on 40 or 50 undeveloped fields in their country, some of which are quite large. They're harder and more expensive than the fields they've chosen to develop, but they're there. And they've said that they're going to stick at 12.5 million barrels a day for a while. Of course, they'll be producing much less than that, so that'll be a significant increase in the world's capacity. Now, most of the people that write on this subject who aren't actually involved in the business in the region don't really appreciate the amount of discovered undeveloped resource that's there or the potential to add resources through improved and enhanced oil recovery. You know, our own estimate is that there's over 400 billion barrels of oil that can be added from these sources in the Arabian Gulf countries alone. Now, Rob asked me to mention just briefly, well, what's on the mind of these people in the Gulf, the resource owners, as they look out at the future? They know this is going to be really hard for them to do. They haven't ever taken on these challenges. And you really, just to put it in a nutshell, there's two different points of view. If you talk to the national oil companies, they're very nervous and they're seeking help actively. And that's why many of these countries are opening up their upstream business. If you talk to the people in the ministries, and particularly in finance and other parts of the government, they're pretty content with their lot today, and they're not sure they need to open up and meet this demand. So that's a tension that's taking place in these countries today, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. Just wanted to put this into the context of the total global resource base as we estimate it. About a quarter of the world's oil has been produced, and about a fifth of the world's gas. If you look at these segments, the produced is in gray, then comes the remaining developed, then the discovered undeveloped I mentioned, growth, which is the enhanced and improved oil recovery, unconventional resources that Rob mentioned, such as very heavy oil, and then the undiscovered potential. A lot of the people that think we're about to run out of oil, again, they're focusing on what's been produced and what's the remaining developed, not fully appreciating the very large additional components to the world's resource base. Now, if you played this ahead to 2030, just looking at oil, that produced quarter would about double in size, from about 1 trillion to, or a little over a trillion to a little over 2 trillion. And so you might say, well, gosh, we'll have used up half the oil. And, you know, maybe that is what will take place. But I wanted to conclude with just a historic view of the resource base. And what I've pulled out here is this is somewhat selective because, you know, every year there are many, many estimates published. But I've gone back to 1920 to a paper by David White, a chief scientist at the USGS, and selected what I think are some of the leading experts over time in their estimates of the world's oil resource base. And I think there's a trend here. David White said that there were 50 billion barrels of oil in the world and that the production in the U.S. would peak in 5 years, 1925. Actually, it peaked in the early 70s, so he was off by about 50 years. M. King Hubbard in 1956 correctly predicted the peak of production in the United States, and then he also predicted that world oil production would peak in 2000. And I think he may be as far off on that prediction as David White was with his prediction for the U.S. in 1920. Now, you can use your own imagination to think what we'll be saying if we could come back here in 2030 as to the size of the resource base. But my estimate is that it's going to be somewhat larger, driven mainly by technology improvements in recovering unconventional resources and improving recovery from existing resources. And I would also say that we'll have much improved efficiency, and that you know, the impact of doing this is probably going to be less than we think it will be. There are 4 key challenges that I'd like to mention that we need to think about. It's not the resource base. That's not the big challenge we face. Number 1 is access to the resources. Will the governments allow us to come into their countries and assist them with developing these resources? Because if you look where the resources are today, the countries that own them don't really have the technology to do it. Second is physical capacity constraints in the industry. Are there enough drilling rigs? Is there enough steel for pipe? Is there enough cement, et cetera, et cetera? We're really stretched thin today, and costs have tracked prices of commodities right through the roof, so that it's very expensive and very time-consuming to find what you need to do a major development today. Third is the capital required. It's a huge amount of money, trillions and trillions of dollars, to meet demand for hydrocarbons, not to mention other energy sources in this outlook. And especially given with what we're seeing in financial markets today, I think it's a good question. Will there be enough money to do this? The last point is human capacity. In our industry, over the next 10 years, about 40% of the scientists and engineers will retire. I'm probably going to be one of them. And so that means we're going to have a great shortage of experienced people in our industry. That's a challenge. It's also a great opportunity for any young scientists and engineers here at Princeton or elsewhere who are looking for a challenging place to work. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks.
David Goldwyn has an MPA from this institution who's hosting this right now in 1986, and he's the president of his own company, Goldwyn International Strategies Limited. He was National Security Deputy to Ambassador Richardson at the United Nations. He was Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs at the DOE. He's now working on projects at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. All parts of the world are his interest, and the current common theme is energy. Let's welcome David Goldwyn.
Thanks. Good afternoon. It's good to be here. Richard, I got to lower this a lot more than where you had it. First of all, it's great to be back on campus after all these years, and to still see some old friends. And this is really a perfect topic, a grand challenge for the engineering school and the Woodrow Wilson School to address together. And my topic is the challenge of energy to our national security. And it's a great intersection for these two schools because, at least in my view, the challenge is national security and it's international. The first place that action needs to be taken is domestically. Technology is the answer. Everyone says that's the answer, but we don't have a policy framework to actually get where we need to go in order to drive that technological change and to reduce the role of carbon and the role of oil in our economy over the long term. So we do need to work together on this challenge, and it is grave, and I'd say it's also really difficult, and I'm going to try hard to be an optimist, but it's hard to be when we look at what we're up against. The main points I want to make to you today are these, that energy is a national security challenge. Second, that everything you hear from politicians today about energy independence, including many politicians whom I wholeheartedly support, is a complete myth. There is no energy independence. We can't drill our way, invent our way to be independent in the world. And as the power we are in the world, if we have no dependence on oil whatsoever, but China and India and Europe do, then we're still insecure from a national security point of view. Third, the way we fix the oil dependence national security problem and the way we fix the carbon emissions climate problem is different. They are integrated, as we have talked about, but they require different solutions. None of them are quick. I don't know if Richard gave that number, but today the world consumes 86 million barrels of oil a day. A day. There's no way you can just flip that to windmills or solar or anything over a long period of time. It's a whole portfolio of changes. It's a huge amount of resource, and it's growing. So there are no quick solutions, but if we don't start now, we never get where we're going to go. And there's two baskets of solutions, and I'm going to read them really quick to keep in my 10 minutes when we get there. But basically, we have to lead at home because we're a huge part of the consumption in the market, because we're a global power, and also we have no credibility overseas if we're not taking care of our own business. And second, we need to change the way we do foreign policy over the next 20 or 30 years to get through the next 20 or 30 years when we will rely and, in fact, demand access from a number of these resource producers. Got to define your terms. Energy security. Energy security is not $2 gasoline, which is what most Americans think. Energy security for most people in the world is about survival. If you are China, you're worried about having enough energy to keep your economy going in general, and in case there's a conflict between China and the U.S. over the Taiwan Straits, that you can survive an embargo. If you're living in Ukraine or Belarus or Georgia, and the gas or the lights go off in the middle of the winter because Russia decides it wants to bring in a market in a couple of weeks instead of over time, maybe because they don't like the color of your government, that's a national security problem. That's not just about energy. It's not just about economics and environment. So for most countries in the world, energy security is first about survival. It's about power. It's about autonomy. and it's the ability to get the resources you need to run your economy. It's about being able to pursue your foreign policy without coercion from your suppliers, a problem we have from time to time. And it's about the avoidance of economic and environmental injury. If you're an island state, energy security is whether you're all going to need scuba gear to get through every day, or for us, whether we're going to choke on our own emissions. So that's what energy security is to me. And as a national security problem, we've got all kinds of problems, and they are urgent and grave problems we have today. One is our ability to forge coalitions in the world on things like genocide or non-proliferation. We can't get China in the Security Council on Sudan and genocide there because they get a huge amount of their oil for Sudan, and they have sunk a lot of money in there. We can't get the Europeans to say boo to Russia while it renationalized the oil industry, the press, most of the government, because they are hugely dependent on Russian oil and gas and investment. And on Iran, we've had for decades a huge amount of problems, and now they're worse now, trying to get people to increase economic pressure in a non-military way to have Iran give up its enrichment program or its weapons program or its support for terrorism. And we can't do it for two reasons. One is $112 oil, nobody wants to take 2 million barrels a day off the market or be responsible for it and drive oil to $140 a barrel. Second, a lot of countries, not ours, are trying to compete for access in Iran because it's an enormous resource base, and they don't want to be seen as opposing the Iranians. So our ability to do really important business in the world is certainly challenged. Our loss of global influence, Venezuela, we just don't matter anymore because President Chavez has a huge amount of money, enough to be able to buy Argentina's bonds, to buy all the soybean crop from Bolivia. We don't matter so much, and neither does our support for markets or our support for democracy, and that's really where it matters. And then you have the impunity of the oil rich. You know, this is the resource curse. If you have enough money, you don't need to tax people, then you can be aggressive with your people, you can be aggressive with your neighbors. And some of the pictures up here, these are the boys from MEND. British military experts said, I've seen those weapons before. That's what our guys have in Iraq. So you've got the Niger Delta insurgency, you've got Russia's impunity and Chavez, which we've talked about, and then you have competition from China, which is completely legitimate in Africa. But as we try and create stability by forging standards on environment or standards on transparency, we've got non-market competition that is not interested in those same standards, and we're having a hard time competing with it. So we've got the erosion of the oil market itself, countries trying to lock up supply, not really a lot of supply right now, but if we need to have a liquid oil market in order to be able to have supply meet demand, and then we have this access problem, which is we have huge demand and the market will not bring supply on because countries don't want to do it either because they want to keep it in the ground or because of nationalism reasons or they think they can do it better. And then we have last the erosion of the collective energy security system, this thing we built in 1975 after the Arab oil embargo, where all the world's consumers got together to have technology and strategic reserves, and then we had 65, 70% of the world's consumers in that association. Well, now we're about 40% because China's not in and India's not in. And so you don't have collective energy security unless you have most of the world's consumers. I'll touch on these next two slides lightly. I mean, the two things you have to understand is that if you're trying to deal with dependence on oil, we're talking about planes, trains, and automobile. We don't reuse oil for electric power. So 40% of what we use in the U.S. is liquids. About, I can't read that with my glasses, 70% goes for transportation. Don't fix the transportation problem, you're not dealing with the national security problem. You're talking about emissions, electricity comes largely, in terms of emissions problems, from coal, not very much from petroleum. So you want to deal with the climate problem, which is important, you've got to deal with coal. So there are different technologies, different answers, both important to do. This slide is probably completely impossible to read from where you're standing, but it was done by a colleague of mine who is a nuclear physicist at MIT, Ernie Moniz. He was an undersecretary of energy, and what it's supposed to show you on this side is that for every major problem you have, oil in bad places, environmental stress, not wanting nuclear energy to provide proliferation, building infrastructure, there is a technology pathway, a way that you can change the way that those problems exist. And there are a whole list of solutions from gas to liquids, biofuels, advanced engines. There are things that we can do. It's not, I think, a technology problem in that we don't know what kind of technologies we would use. It's a problem that we can't make them commercial or deploy them on a commercial scale. And so that leads us to how we doing on this problem, and the answer is really, really poorly. U.S. politics defeat demand management. You know, CAFE standards. We just passed a new bill with 35 miles a gallon by 2015 or 2020. We don't even aspire to the kind of fuel efficiency that already exists in Europe today. 35 by 2020, you can rent a car that gets 40 miles a gallon in Europe right now. So, it's a big step forward, hugely important, but I think not ambitious. The technological solutions we've talked about a little bit today, clean coal requires sequestration. Sequestration is great. There is not a commercial scale carbon sequestration project in the world in existence today. Some oil fields have it. We know how to do it, but you've got to test like 3 of these things at a commercial scale, provide a legal framework. So we need to do it, but we're talking 5 or 10 years. Biofuels, cellulosic is in the Exxon prediction, but there is not a commercial level cellulosic ethanol plant in existence today because we haven't figured out how to break down the sugars enough to do it on a commercial scale. So will it be a solution? Absolutely. Will it be important? Could be 10 or 15% of what we put in our cars. Is it available right now? No, and nuclear has its own issues. The other thing is internationally, we're doing pretty poorly trying to build a consensus to get reciprocal access. We can use trade as a weapon to try and change the way countries behave, but we don't have trade authority ourselves. And then we've got the nationalization problem Richard has talked about, all kinds of places where countries are giving less access, controlling more, and using the money for bad purposes. This slide, also probably pretty hard to read from where you're sitting, has all the 3 major presidential candidates. And I guess if you could read the fine print on this, what it would say is that they're all for efficiency. That the Democrats are for technology, a big technology push, $50–60 billion to try and fix these problems. They're all for some kind of cap and trade system, but they don't say what or whether it'll be stationary sources or mobile sources or where the cap is and will it be enough to drive the price of carbon to $25–30 a ton, which is what you need for these solutions to be commercial. So not a lot of courage there, but kind of hard to have during a campaign. How am I doing? Time-wise? Okay. So the last two slides are this. So what should we do? Because I went to policy school, and you can design the problem maybe in other schools, but the Wilson School, you always had to have the solution that you have at the end. So I got to have my solution. So here's my top 10 list, and it's not comprehensive, but I actually think the answer at home and abroad for both oil and for power is a serious cap and trade policy that addresses both stationary sources like power plants and mobile sources like transportation. Because we will never get a political consensus to have 50-mile-a-gallon cars. We'll just never pull it off, and we'll never get a gas tax or a carbon tax, which is another good way, a way that I've long favored for trying to drive this. But everybody's for cap and trade, and if you have a serious cap, and we're trying to harmonize that across the country and internationally, that will drive change in efficiency. It will make efficiency technologies commercial, and if you apply that to transportation as well, it will affect, you want to be careful how you do it, but it will mean that oil companies will be energy companies, that they will know that they are in the get a lot more miles out of every vehicle business for the long term, and this isn't a gasoline bubble. Because before you drop $2 billion, $5 billion into something that assumes $100 oil, you want to make sure it's going to be there. Frankly, nobody believed it for a long time. So we need some sort of floor there. I think that's the main way. The other ones we can talk about in Q&A, but essentially we got to put technology where we have problems and bottlenecks and we need to support the market, not where the senator from that state particularly wants to have a plant. And that's where we've got it right now. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to have maybe strategic reserves and things like natural gas and promote energy efficiency and conservation across the board. But we got to do foreign policy different because we're not going to fix this problem for 20 years. We're going to deal with African countries. We're going to deal with the Caspian. We're going to deal with the Middle East. We're going to want access. We're going to need to use a whole lot more oil before we're able to reduce what we're going to do. So the first thing we ought to do is get back in the business of practicing diplomacy and particularly stability and conflict. You wanted to add 500,000 barrels a day to the oil market right away, you'd resolve the conflict in the Niger Delta because that's about how much is shut in. If you wanted to, to bring another 2 million barrels a day onto the market, you might have left Iraq alone, and they might have gotten there through a different way. Now it's going to take a while to get there. But deal with protecting the stability of existing producers and keeping new revolutions from happening. Second, modernize our collective energy security system. That's about bringing the Chinese and the Indians in. We need to promote reform and transparency so countries don't go boom, which is getting into the business of helping countries be more transparent about where the money comes and how they use it. promote free market and energy. Even though I took the B-level economics here rather than the calculus, I know what a monopsony wedge is, or at least I learned. And that's talking about using the power of consumers, and particularly our markets, and saying, if you want access to our markets, you've got to give us a little access to your market. It's about reciprocity. And we have a lot of that power, and that's, I think, how we get at the access issue over the long term. And finally, we can use energy as a tool of soft power and bring electricity to the masses. So in closing, I guess what I would say is this. From my point of view, this is a huge and serious problem, but it's not a money problem because we have enough money. And it's not really a technology problem because we know what the technology problems. It's a problem of educating the population enough about the realities so we build a social consensus to change it, and it's about leadership. It's about having a president of the United States who will stand up and tell people, you're going to pay more for energy, but you're going to be safer, and there is no other way. And we have not had that. And if on September 12th our president had stood up and said, I need a quarter a gallon more for you this year and every year for the next decade, and in 20 years, I promise you, we will live in a different world, people would have stood up and said, yes, sir, thank you, I'll do it. But that moment passed, and we don't want to wait for another crisis. So what we'll take is new leadership and brave leadership and an educated population such as yours and scientists and leaders who come out of both of these schools. So I hope you produce them, and thanks for listening.
I was thinking that another reformulation is that Grand Challenges is about leadership, because we really are taking these remarkable students in the front end and putting them into giving them a sense of themselves. That means that they hear this and they say, that's me. And I think that's what's happening. Anne Florini is batting third. She has been spending the year in Singapore, where she is the director of the Center on Asia and Globalisation at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And she has interests across the board in international relations, environment, and development. She co-chairs the International Task Force on Transparency, which is at Columbia. And her book was called The Coming Democracy, New Roles for a New World. She is the kind of person who evokes in me the thought there is such a thing as a global citizen. Anne.
Thank you. What I've been working on for the last couple of decades broadly falls under the heading of global governance, otherwise known as how to run the world. And what I'm trying to figure out now is there a way of running the world when it comes to energy policy and energy issues? The International Energy Agency does an assessment every year called the World Energy Outlook. And I saw the then head of the IEA do a presentation last year on the 2006 World Energy Outlook, in which he diagnosed the energy problem as being one of energy policy that is not consistent with reality. And he's right. If you project forward the continuation of current policies, according to the IEA, the world is going to need something like $22 trillion of new investment just to meet its energy needs. And on current path, that investment is not going to go to the right places. And there's a number of reasons it's not going to go to the right places, and a number of reasons that we have not just an energy security problem, not just a global climate change problem, but a whole series of interrelated problems that all have to be dealt with as one integrated problem. Most of my fellow panelists are talking specifically about energy security. I just want to raise one point on energy security. The World Bank Institute has done some interesting assessments of how stable and how well governed the countries are where the oil resources are to be found. And I'm not sure how well this is showing up out there, but if you look at the correlation, there is pretty much an inverse correlation. The more oil you have, the worse you are governed. Basically, Norway and the United Kingdom are the only ones up there who have much in the way of fossil fuel resources that are truly well governed, and it falls off very sharply thereafter. So we're talking about getting our hydrocarbons primarily from places that are a real mess and likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Second big problem in the energy area is one I think we're all very familiar with. We're overheating the planet. I'm not going to spend any particular time talking about climate change, just to raise a couple of questions that have become really compelling for me living in Singapore for the last couple of years. What are we going to do when there's 100 million Bangladeshi refugees? That's a question nobody is talking about. They all know the question is out there. They haven't a clue what to do with it. So whatever we do with energy policy generally has to be carbon constrained, and we're only beginning to figure out how to do that. But there's a couple of other major issues that rarely get brought into the conversation about how you govern energy, how you deal with energy. A huge one is on economic development. Lack of access to energy resources is another way of defining poverty. If you don't have access to basic energy resources, you are by definition poor. And there's an awful lot of people who by that definition are extraordinarily poor. 2.5 billion people relying on traditional biofuels, burning cow dung and plant waste. There's 1.6 billion who lack any access to electricity services at all. Imagine life with no electricity ever. There's 2.5 million people dying every year from the health consequences of depending on that kind of traditional biomass. United Nations has been saying for years, there's no way the Millennium Development Goals can be met in most parts of the world if we don't solve the energy problem. But energy is not part of what's being dealt with in the Millennium Development Goals. Fourth set of problems has to do with human rights violations that are associated with the extractive industries across the board. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into all of the various cases. I think everybody's probably familiar or has heard of at least some of them. There's a very interesting study that has been done by John Ruggie at Harvard University. Ruggie is now the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Business and Human Rights. And he did an assessment on exactly what the relationship is between big business and human rights around the world, and found that the vast majority of major human rights violations in the corporate sector are associated with extractive industries. As he put it, no other sector has so enormous and intrusive a social and environmental footprint. At local levels in poor countries, there's no effective public institutions in place. So there's an authority vacuum that tends to get filled in ways that are not necessarily in the interest of the local population. So we have four big sets of problems: energy security, climate change, development, and human rights. Stacked up against that, what do we have to have in place in the way of institutions, organizations, tools, measures to deal with this whole complex of issues? Well, we have a lot of pieces out there: national governments, markets, firms, both private and state-owned, a whole alphabet soup of various kinds of international organizations and G groups, et cetera, et cetera. We have funding through the World Bank and other kinds of funders. We have an enormous range of partnerships and initiatives. We have an enormous range of advocacy organizations, primarily dealing with climate change. So we have a lot of pieces out there. What does it all add up to? Well, if you talk about the national governments, this is George Bush and others with our 2005 energy bill. As David said earlier, our national policy on energy is not one that is likely to solve that fourth set of interrelated problems that I was talking about. And it's not just us. The US is particularly bad on some fronts, but most national governments have energy policies that are, as Claude Mandel put it, not consistent with reality, at least in the long term. But it's hugely important what national governments do. To take just one element of it, we're never going to get the technologies developed and diffused into the marketplace that we need to have to get ourselves off the carbon path without really effective national policies. It's not going to happen purely through market forces. We could get very much faster and very sustained growth in renewable energy technologies, much more so than the Exxon forecast assumes, if we had very different national policies, but we don't. Let me talk about just a couple of the other actors that would seem to be really key actors in trying to figure out how you deal with this complex of problems. First is the International Energy Agency, which from its name you would assume is the world body dealing with energy. It is no such thing. The International Energy Agency has a membership that is limited to the members of the OECD. It was set up after the first oil shock in the 1970s, specifically to solve the problem of stability in oil markets, and for that purpose only. It has what used to be a very effective arrangement for stockpiling and sharing of petroleum stockpiles for emergency sharing, which I think has been invoked twice. But as was said earlier, I think by Rick, given that much of the demand is now coming from countries that are outside this stockpiling arrangement, there is a significant curtailing of an erosion of this collective energy security system. And the IEA does not deal very much at all with the development issues and not at all with the human rights issues. Another actor that's played a big role in talking about energy policy is the G8. It began in the mid-1970s, around the same time as the IEA, and largely for the same reason, the disruptions in the global economy caused by the first oil shock. If you look at the declarations that the G8 issues every year, or used to be the G7, how much attention they pay to energy directly tracks oil prices. They pay attention to energy only when oil prices are high, and the rest of the time they ignore it. They have, on rare occasions, actually made some meaningful commitments, usually on a fairly small scale. Although they talk about energy a lot, and obviously are talking about energy a whole lot lately, in terms of being an effective decision-making body dealing with energy issues in a comprehensive fashion, the G8, I think, is a pretty thin reed on which to base our hopes. Third actor that I want to talk about very briefly is the World Bank. The G8 has, for the last couple of years, been pushing the World Bank very hard to be the primary place to talk about clean energy and funding for clean energy. This has raised a couple of problems, and the World Bank has come up with all sorts of proposals for a clean energy fund, various other development funds. First problem is that the developing countries do not trust the World Bank. Their reaction to the G8 proposals, putting forward the World Bank as the source of funding through which everything will be channeled, is, once again, the rich countries want to control our development. They don't have our interest in mind. We don't trust the World Bank, and we don't want them telling us what we should do on energy policy. This is just another excuse to try to take away our fossil fuels and make us buy certain energy technologies from the rich countries. The other is that the World Bank doesn't have a lot of credibility when it comes to clean energy. What these two graphs show is how much of the World Bank's funding has actually gone to fossil fuels and how much has gone to other energy sources. The very little, very small, probably invisible black slivers are the funding that the World Bank has put into clean energy, and all the rest is fossil fuels. But boy, are there a lot of other efforts out there. I'm not going to spend the time to go through all of them, but there's all sorts of networks, initiatives, coalitions. Many of them are public-private partnerships involving actors from all over the world, all sorts of efforts to try to educate regulators, develop new technologies, disseminate new technologies. None of them is operating at a very large scale. You're talking about initiatives of a few millions, maybe a few hundreds of millions of dollars. But at least there is a seed out there on which we could build. So then the question is, where next? How do we deal with this situation of massive problems, no institutional space within which to deal with these problems, and the need to come up with something like $22 trillion in new investment and figure out where it's going to go? There's a couple of ways we could proceed. One way is to take a whole bunch of baby steps, building on a whole bunch of the existing initiatives. For those of you who know something about energy policy, we could do things like try to entice Russia into the Energy Charter Treaty. We could expand the International Energy Agency's current outreach efforts with India and China. We could shift the Doha round negotiations to focus more on energy and the needs of energy for development. A bunch of other steps like that that could be taken. The of issues in the energy field seems a bit implausible, but it's certainly not impossible. We don't really know what this could all add up to, and certainly those are steps that all ought to be taken. But I think where we really need to be trying to aim for is something that's much more of a coherent framework, one that brings together these what appear to be very different issues that are dealt with by very different parts of governments, by very different types of experts, so that you have energy security, climate change, development, and human rights all being talked about as part of one big complex of problems. And why would you do that? Well, there's a famous quote from Eisenhower that one way to deal with a really big problem is to make it bigger. And the reason you make it bigger is because then you can have trade-offs across the issue areas. It's exactly the way good trade negotiations are supposed to work. Given that if you deal with climate change purely as a climate change issue, it's a zero-sum game. Given that if you deal with most of these issues on their own, they are zero-sum games, it would seem to me that trying to bring them together so that you can have effective trade-offs across issues at least offers some scope for bargains that we can't currently undertake, and we don't have an institutional basis for undertaking. The question is, where do you have that conversation? The answer is, right now, we don't know, but I think Carol has some ideas along those lines. Thank you.
So Carol Dumaine works at the Department of Energy, whereas she's in some sense seconded from the CIA. She can correct me if that's not quite right. It's a British word. She's the head of a newly created directorate in the Department of Energy called Energy and Environmental Security in the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence at the U.S. Department of Energy. I have to confess I know the Department of Energy pretty well, and I didn't realize there was such a directorate there. And it's obviously an extremely interesting place, as I've been learning about it from Carol. She is fascinated with the organization of information, and she's seeking new modalities for the organization of information. She studies how scenarios are used, alternative analytical methods, and she's an inventor. Carol.
Whoops. Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here, and I would like to applaud the Princeton University's initiative with the Grand Challenges program. It really resonates with me, in particular with its emphasis on the irreducible nature of the challenges and the mixtures within the challenges that we face. That word irreducible is one that I would focus on. Because we're facing a grand challenge when we look at energy, environment, and security together. And that grand challenge might be summed up as having to harness mankind's intellect and imagination to deal with unprecedented challenges facing our planet. Uncommon challenges require uncommon solutions. My background is as an intelligence analyst, primarily at the Central Intelligence Agency, and I was asked to come over to the Department of Energy to apply some of the things I've been doing to the issue of energy and environment taken together, not peeled apart as they usually are, and to demonstrate this area as an area for strategic intelligence, which for those of you who don't know, basically means strategic warning and foresight. It's situational awareness of how the future could unfold in different ways and how that could affect national security. One of the things I brought to this job is a conviction that publicly available information is a key ingredient of intelligence, and it may not be commonly known, but at least since the 1950s, it's constituted at least 90% of intelligence input. So I'd like to speak today a little bit about what intelligence is, why we're applying this to energy and environment, how we're trying to approach this challenge, and maybe how you can help. Intelligence is about distinguishing what we know from what we don't know and informing policymakers in a timely way about what they need to know so that they can make better decisions. Strategic intelligence is basically about increasing our readiness today for the unexpected. But as you know, whatever field you're in science or policy making, analysis and intelligence, you rarely have all the information you think you need. You rarely have 100% certainty. And if you do, you should question it, as these quotes show. The last quote is of interest and relevance to us today because just as combatant commanders need to know their battlefield environment, so decision makers today need to have enhanced insights into the underlying dynamics of how energy, environment, and security interrelate, and they also need to know how the context, the global context, can affect national security. General Sullivan, as some of you might know, was part of a panel of retired high-level military leaders who last year at this time produced a report called Climate Change and National Security that looked at whether climate change was a national security issue. Most of them said they were agnostic going into this effort about whether climate change was a national security issue, and they came out of it saying that it was. But does that mean it's an area for intelligence? The former chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence had an article in the Wall Street Journal, again about a year ago, saying that we have limited intelligence resources and they should be focused on counterterrorism, threats to American lives. Let spies be spies. The evolution of American intelligence, however, dates from the 1940s and is in a framework of national security that posits that threats to the nation come in the form of external adversaries, namely human actors with intentions possibly threatening to U.S. interests. But if we look at intelligence from a larger optic, it's about foreknowledge about what could happen, what could affect the well-being of the people. And secrets are a means to an end, just as publicly available information and ability to adapt are means to the end of intelligence. So how did we approach this problem since I arrived at DOE about 10 months ago? We've had 3 international workshops, one of which was held in Scotland in November. We've involved people from over 24 nations in considering the nature of the challenge. And in the left column, you see that people who participated, who included laboratory scientists, academics, business leaders, and government, said that their second and third order effects stemming from the intersections of energy and environment and security that we really don't understand, that these are highly interdependent issues. And because of our backgrounds, we generally don't know how to deal with irreducible challenges. Analysis, by definition, is about reducing things into parts and studying the parts and putting them back together. We also learned that this is beyond traditional national security. That's what I mentioned just now, and that we might need to broaden our concept of national security, and that the knowledge exists in many, many domains, and mostly outside of government. We decided that we need to learn from natural systems and even nature, and that what we're evolving might be an ecosystem itself, an ecosystem with requisite variety of expertise and insight to mirror the challenge of the complex system we're facing. So this is just one illustration of many, many different factors that are interrelating, and it's not at all complete. It's just to demonstrate that governments really do lack a capacity for aggregating all of this, distilling it in a way that busy policymakers or leaders of businesses, reinsurance industries, and others can use to make decisions for the future. What's come out of the 3 international conferences, the last one was just held last month, is basically to try to evolve a global knowledge ecosystem that is inclusive of different sectors, government, business, and NGOs, to take a systems approach to what is viewed as a systems problem. One strand you'll see braided through here is to identify what the emergent security issues are. Another is to link up the scientists better, such as in our DOE National Laboratory Network, with academics and business people, to emphasize methods for strategic foresight and warning, and to learn from business, which is making major inroads in something often called open innovation. This is collaboration in open platforms among competitors, and I could cite some examples in the Q&A if that's desired. This is just an image to try to reinforce the interrelationships that we need to be considering between the spread of disease and decisions about energy sources, the impact of perhaps more rapid than expected global changes in the environment, and what the challenge is for people in intelligence, for instance, just to understand that some of the most elusive knowledge is actually something we can get at only through new cooperative and collaborative arrangements, and they're actually quite vital to our national and global security. Some illustrations of security-type issues in this area. Some are more familiar than others to you, I'm sure, and they're all just illustrative, but I would put the last one first, which is preparedness for low-probability, high-impact scenarios. I think that, for instance, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is great work. They're focusing mostly on the high-probability scenarios, and I think that General Sullivan in the beginning would say we need to focus on the low-probability, high-impact scenarios. This is a scheme of looking at how we might move forward, understanding that intelligence does inform national security and policymakers, but that in turn needs to be informed by a global context. We need to start asking how we can understand the relationships and patterns between all of the things that we face, which are suggested in an incomplete list on the right-hand side. What we're seeing in business and in things like the Wikipedia and so forth is that, this is really a global challenge requiring a global approach. And our evolving knowledge ecosystem, which is really in the very, very early stages, imagines creating, some people said before lunch, an institution, but leveraging the fact that most innovation occurs in non-institutional spaces, so this wouldn't be specifically one institution's project, but a multi-stakeholder system that leverages different capabilities, and not just in the energy and environment sector, but also, as you can see, futures thinking and horizon scanning. So in sum, our approach is to emphasize that this is unclassified, leveraging the global ingenuity and expertise, understanding that we're dealing with complex systems, not typically really handled well by traditional analysis, and prioritizing questions which need to be asked, and understanding how the national concerns interrelate with global drivers and impacts. What we focused on traditionally is amassing our knowledge, our individual knowledge. We have lots and lots of experts on all aspects, but looking across it and trying to identify those uncommon approaches and those different perspectives, we're going to need different ways to work together. This calls for a boldly inclusive, but equally boldly focused approach. Thank you.
You must have lots of questions, and so I think we should immediately open this up to comments from the audience. Direct your questions at any one or everyone.
Yes, do I have the floor? For Dr. Goldwyn, perhaps all the other panelists, the recent article in Scientific American, which I believe was titled Solar, the Grand Plan, speaks of covering over a good portion of the Southwest with solar reflectors, turning this heat into thermal heat, generating electricity 24 hours a day, transporting it our way, and then storing excess to run over 24 hours by gas compression and then gas generation, gas being a neutral gas. I wonder what your comments on this, whether is it all feasible or whether it's just pie in the sky. They claim that they're going to be able to replace all our electrical needs, all imported oil and gas, even coal generation.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not a doctor. I should have gotten my PhD in electrical engineering to answer that one. It seems highly implausible to me, at least in two big bites. One is for the volume of energy that we need, I don't see how you translate it into transportation until we have redesigned a system where we have vehicles we can plug into the grid even at night to use electricity to power them. That's not implausible that we might get there at some point in the future, but we're not there now. So the transportation oil substitution part of it seems completely implausible. The second is that we consume a huge amount of energy for electricity, and Richard would have a better grip on those figures than I would. But the idea that you would be able to produce so much that you would provide baseload electricity, and that you would have a grid that's interconnected enough to wheel that power from the Southwest to all over the country, I think is not possible now given the kind of segregated grids that we have, and I just don't think you can get there in volume. But sectorally, without doubt, if you cover the whole Southwest in solar panels, you can generate an awful lot of electricity. I have not heard that we have the battery capacity to store electricity. That's a big challenge overall, so I don't understand the gas part of that, how that works. But you can use solar, you can substitute it for other things. It can be a great add-on as long as you're sure the sun shines 24/7 so that you can turn the lights on at night.
Well, the coverage was only 30,000 square miles of solar reflectors, and the generation at this end would be compressing gas and then running back to the generator.
Let me comment, because I have read the article and I do think about these sorts of things. It's a vision article. It's not an implementation article. It runs the numbers to show you that, well, one way to start, and I start this sometimes with my classes, is 10,000 times more energy falls on the planet from the sun than we use in our commercial energy system. So there are options of collecting a lot of solar energy and moving it around, which would let us have an all-solar modern world. Many, many steps between here and there, some of which are spelled out there, and therefore a time frame that is certainly not a decade. It is implied that we will have a major investment in electricity infrastructure, comparable to the building of the national highway system. There is a lot of argument for doing that, even if this weren't the vision. But one of the arguments is that renewable energy is in remote places relative to loads, the strongest sources of renewable energy, and this was laying out how you might use the Southwest and transmission lines of a kind that we scarcely have in order to get this electricity to move 2,000 miles. Storage issues that go way beyond today's technology, but if you were an engineer or a scientist wanting to get stimulated into things you might work on to make this come about, you had an interesting article to begin with. It purports to have a policy implementation phase. At that point, I think that article actually completely falls apart. It wants to subsidize for 10 years, and then that would be enough. And to me, that was completely cockamamie. But the technology part is a vision, and there's a comparable vision coming from the nuclear community and from other communities, putting satellites in space and beaming things down. One of the things that a Grand Challenge in Energy has to do is equip students to take these and tease them apart. Can we get over there?
Thank you. A question for Mr. Vierbuchen. The current price of oil, going up as it is, seems to be creating a perverse incentive for many of the, if not most of the oil-producing countries, in that the higher it goes, the happier they are to take their money and not worry about the long-term investment, because their current cash flow is more than adequate, and they're not really going to look more than 5, 10 years at the most into the future in maintaining that cash flow. Do you see this as putting a noticeable crimp in supply over the next 5, 10, 20 years within the scope of Exxon's planning?
That effect is about today. I mean, you hear that. If you look at countries, resource-rich countries around the world, and by the way, the reason that so many of today's sources of oil are poorly governed countries is because we worked through the well-governed countries in the last century, and this is what we're left with. But if you look at countries today that are dependent on the resources, you can put them into two big buckets. There are those that have a very low GDP per capita, such as Nigeria, Angola, probably Kazakhstan, you lump in there, a lot of them. And then there are those that have a very high GDP per capita, such as Qatar, the Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. These are the countries where this point of view is starting to become apparent as a minority point of view. I mean, if you're, with the problems in countries like Nigeria, Angola, they don't have the luxury of taking that point of view because their needs are so pressing today. But, for example, last year there was a debate in the Kuwaiti parliament on exactly this subject with a large contingent arguing against projects that the leaders of Kuwait have been advocating for about 10 years now to open up their resources and increase production. They're arguing for those very same reasons. And we've seen that in some other countries. So far, it's really not a majority opinion, but it is a noticeable minority opinion. I don't think long-term that's going to have a big impact because, and this is just a personal opinion, the forces that caused oil to be volatile in the past are still in play. And I believe we're going to see volatility in the future, and even a drop of $20 or $30 a barrel would shut down that debate today.
Wanted to ask another question of Richard. I'd like to take you to the biofuels for a moment. I recognize that isn't a big part of your overall picture, but the growth is very rapid that you envision. Have you projected, is that based on projections about some of these policies currently being mandated, for example, the EU very high renewable fuel share that they're projecting? It seems that there's already a bit of pushback from green-oriented consumers and whatnot who are suggesting this may be damaging to the environment. And what have you projected for these policies, both in the EU and the U.S.?
I'm not an expert on this, but I know our forecast assumes continued subsidies and tariffs and policies to increase or support production of biofuels. And the things that have been happening over the last 3 to 6 months, some of the work that was done here, I understand was talked about this morning. I wasn't here, but that may cause us to adjust next year. So we may have a slightly different outlook next year. Thank you.
This is a question from Mr. Vierbuchen. One of the constraints on a purely electric automobile is the capacity of batteries. Now, I've been reading the little columns that ExxonMobil puts into the New York Times, and I read that ExxonMobil has been sponsoring quite a bit of research into electric batteries. I wonder if you can give us some indication of where that research is going and what we might expect 5 to 10 years out with respect to an electric car that might go 400, 500 miles on a charge?
I think it was late last year, we announced a new invention. And actually, last year we had a number of very significant inventions that will be contributing to increased energy efficiency. The one you're referring to is a battery film that will allow construction of larger lithium-ion batteries, which will be, again, I'm out of my field, but I read the same things you do, which I understand will be a lot lighter and more powerful batteries and will make electric cars a lot more practical. Now, this was an internal invention by our own research company. It's a field we've been active in for many years. We've already built, or in the process of building, a plant to produce this material, and we've already entered into a joint venture with an electric car manufacturer to supply that. And so it's a technology that we think is going to be very important. Another advance that we mentioned last year or developed last year was an onboard converter to produce hydrogen from liquid fuel and then supply that to a fuel cell. And we have also entered into a joint venture with several companies and a university in Israel to begin putting these into industrial vehicles as a first step to try to prove the technology, hoping that eventually this could be the first way that hydrogen-powered cars could come into existence, because it eliminates the problems of transporting hydrogen and storing it on board, because you create it as you need it. So I mean, that's, when I say the outlook is going to change and technology is going to have impact, all of these things, they're going to be, that's just one company. Many, many inventions like that are going to change our view. And as we look ahead, to try to forecast with today's technology is absolutely going to give you the wrong answer. That's one thing we can be sure about.
Let's go to the right-hand side first, yes, and then move it along.
Hi, I'm Carl Robichaud, MPA 04. I just wanted to thank you for your presentations. My question's mostly for David, although I'd like any of you to weigh in if you have thoughts on this. One aspect of security that we haven't talked a lot about that's inextricably tied with energy is the nuclear question. As I understand, there are 22 countries now that have approached the IAEA and said we want to plan to build 22 new countries that don't currently have nuclear energy have approached the IAEA. About a dozen of them are serious about building new nuclear power plants by 2020. And if you're secure in the level of controls we have on civilian nuclear activities, that's probably not a big concern. I've looked at these controls a little bit. I'm not so confident in our ability to prevent diversion of activities, especially when you look at a full fuel cycle, which a lot of these countries are insisting on. So I wanted to get your thoughts. Is this something we should be worried about? As we try to meet our energy needs, if nuclear is going to be a big part of the portfolio, and if nuclear is going to be happening in a lot of countries in which they are in areas that are not 100% secure, in which there are high levels of corruption, in which there's leadership with questionable attributes, is this something we should be concerned about? And how can we prevent that if we are?
Well, I think it is something we need to be concerned about. I think the IAEA learned itself, by the promulgation of the additional protocol, that its fundamental systems for monitoring and securing were inadequate. We learned a little bit more as time went on. I think the benefit, at least with countries that are entering into peaceful uses of nuclear energy, is they can stand up systems of monitoring and control. They're buying newer reactors. They're probably safer. So you have a better shot at a system. But you still got to figure out what you're going to do with the fuel, how they're going to get it, where it's going to go next, are they going to reprocess, or are they not? And those are serious questions. And it raises another question, which is, the whole system for controlling, nuclear materials, is in not very good shape, and the whole non-proliferation treaty, with India, Pakistan, and others, not to mention Iran, is not in good shape. So, people smarter than me need to really reinvent a system which merges the need to have close controls, control of the fuel, as little reprocessing as possible, and some incentives. And I think this was the original way this was conceived, is you exchange assistance in development of peaceful nuclear energy in exchange for controls and monitoring. But I think for everybody to feel secure, including the people who live there, we need to be a generation ahead of where we are right now.
Anne wanted to amplify on that.
Yeah, I think you've identified one of the major immediate issues that needs to be addressed, and that isn't on a very wide scale being addressed. As David said, the non-proliferation regime as a whole it's not just weak, it's disintegrating. It's partly the stresses over Iran, it's partly the chronic problems that we're having with the entire system of global governance organizations, all of which are underfunded, understaffed, undersupported by the member governments. And it's partly the potential damage inflicted by the U.S.-India deal on the whole conceptual basis underlying the non-proliferation regime. You put all of that together and you add in a whole bunch of countries that don't have experience running these kinds of plants, many of which are extremely poorly governed anyhow. It is not a pretty picture. I know, living in Singapore, the fact that Indonesia is talking about siting a nuclear power plant on an active earthquake fault zone is raising some serious concerns, but there's not really much the Singaporeans can do about it except continue to raise concerns. There really isn't a place that they can go, and there certainly is not a coherent, sustained global dialogue happening now on how you combine the efforts to turn to nuclear as a partial solution to the climate change crisis, how you combine that with an effective non-proliferation regime. That conversation is not happening.
Nuclear issues of great interest to a number of us who are involved in this grand challenge. Sir.
This panel seems to have engaged in something of a call to action, having analyzed the problem, identified certain potential solutions to it. And I wonder if we can hark back to something that was said earlier, that many of the energy policies pursued have been unrealistic. Are we being a bit unrealistic in thinking that action taken now will be effective in avoiding all of the potential catastrophes, all of the potential serious consequences of climate change? And then I'd like to come back to something that was said earlier about the unwillingness of some figures in government to, the desire to let spies be spies, not to even undertake an analysis of the potential consequences. Is there any effort underway to address responses to the possible high probability or low probability, high impact events?
Carol?
Okay, I'll address the last. Is this on? Yeah. There are efforts underway, and things are being stimulated just by, world events and greater awareness. My own job is a very new one, and so it was actually unfunded, and those international conferences I mentioned were done through burden-sharing arrangements with other voluntary interested parties, like the one in Scotland. In the government, in the intelligence community, there is a national intelligence assessment that's underway now on climate change, and that could make a difference. My own view, professional and personally, is that environmental issues are a contextual issue. It's like the world we live in, and it's obviously integrated irreducibly with energy and security. So I see catalytic elements bringing the government more actively into this challenge. I hope that answers your question.
Nolan, are we sticking straight to 2:30 as a cutoff? Okay, we have time for maybe one or two questions more.
This question is mostly for Carol, but open to the whole panel. I'm a graduate student in plasma physics, and there's a DOE lab right near campus. And our goal is fusion energy. I think solar power in its current state represents a great option for the current crisis. But at our lab, our goal is to essentially bring the power of the sun to Earth and harness it. And it represents something that's also a large international effort. There's a big international project underway in France, but current funding has actually been entirely cut from that in the last U.S. budget. I was wondering, what are your comments on this? And perhaps, it's also something that doesn't even seem to enter into the consciousness of this debate at all. And what do you think can be done to bring it more to the fore?
What doesn't come into the consciousness of
Well, in all of these presentations,
okay.
Fusion energy wasn't even mentioned.
Fusion, so. Okay. Well, on the solar, obviously in other countries, it's getting a lot of attention as one part of the solution. And my impression, although I am new into the whole area, is that all countries are struggling with what would be the right diversification. There are unintended consequences of, going to more coal or trying to do nuclear or having solar. Germany does solar and wind, but it's mostly for export, not import. So I think that this is all getting much more attention in our country. I just attended a very informative session at Lawrence Livermore last week where 65 experts on all kinds of energy sources spoke. And there was a lot of expertise, but a general sense of this is all very incremental, and we need to look at it as a system. So I'm pretty optimistic that it's getting more attention, but maybe not fast enough.
Instead of having any further questions, I'm sorry. I think the panelists would like each of them to have a final couple of sentences to leave you with, but I would like to amplify the answer just now about Princeton's fusion program, about fusion in general. It is important not to leave out the solution space that involves revolutionary as opposed to evolutionary ways of addressing the climate and security problems, and fusion is high on that list of wouldn't it be wonderful. It's not going to be here immediately. It will transform the story if it's successful. We have to pursue in parallel the approaches that make headway in the matter of a couple of decades and those that will pay off over a longer period of time. It is definitely one of Princeton's assets that makes us special in this, that we have the leading academic-based fusion program of the U.S. right here. Now I'd like to ask each of you to sum up, and can we start on the right here with you, David? Your left.
3 requests. I guess 1, acknowledge the challenge. 2nd, use your voice. 3rd, hold your politicians accountable.
That's a great summary. I just remind you that energy use is going to grow. All sources of energy will be significant, and negative energy efficiency is going to be particularly significant. And longer term, I think there's going to be technologies and breakthroughs we're not contemplating today that will change this whole view of the problem.
And building on that, this has been a fairly pessimistic panel. However, all of the energy projections that we are all basing our analyses and comments on, they're all based on a huge range of assumptions about policy and technology. The only thing that all existing energy projections have in common is that they're all wrong. However, they are a pretty good indication of where we will end up if we don't change the things that are leading us to make those assumptions. We can make change. We can make those kind of changes. So if you don't like the outcomes that are being projected, make sure that we make changes in the technology and the policy so we don't end up where we are currently headed. So yes, this is a call to action, very much so. And I think schools of public policy, schools of engineering, particularly in institutions like Princeton, have an enormous responsibility to respond to that call.
I'll just build right off of what Anne said. Challenging assumptions requires challenging our thinking and bringing in different perspectives. And we have a richness of expertise right here in this room, but we live at a time where we can actually see that a combination of new technologies and new ways to aggregate knowledge might actually offer us different pathways to the future. And I'll just cite, Oxford University's Internet Institute is doing a lot of interesting work in this area. There's a book called The Wealth of Networks by Yochai Benkler. That's a pretty tough read, but it looks at different ways to aggregate knowledge. And then there's a more popular business book called Wikinomics that gives some examples of how businesses are reaching out to people that they don't actually employ to speed up their own learning and their R&D. So I'm actually quite optimistic, but I know we have to do business differently and think differently. Thank you for this opportunity.
I think we've had an extraordinary panel. I'd like you all to acknowledge that.